Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to your Daily Penguin, our tour through my Penguin Classic wall. We are in the long Renaissance. For now, anyway, we've only got a couple of books left to go, and then we will be on to the wild, and who knows what we will have after that. There won't be much in the way of organization, except maybe that some authors will be grouped together, maybe some nationalities, but I'm not even sure of that. I go over that wall all the time. All the time. That's the place where I go. All the rest of these books tremble in fear because they know that if worse came to worse and I only had one wall, they would all be gone and those would stay. And I go to that wall and I just sort of roam around it. And if I pick a book down and stand there reading for a while, or flop onto the bed and read for a while, and then after that while I realize, oh my God, you can't be reading Sentimental Education again. You have work to do. Then I will pop right up and stick it somewhere, but not always in the place where I found it. So who knows what the organization is like in the rest of this. But in this first bookcase, we're mostly sticking to chronological order, roughly speaking, and we're in the long Renaissance. But today, we are dealing with a classic today, and I want to stress that the attitude of Penguin Classic's editorial board in the last 20 years of taking gambles, of doing unconventional choices, the one they always get knocked for is Morrissey's memoir. But they've done a lot of other very unconventional choices, things that a normal, classic, canonical reprint house wouldn't do. And I applaud that. I absolutely applaud it because I trust this editorial team. And I've never been led wrong. Even the Morrissey book, I wouldn't own it. But I did get it. And I did read it. And it was done intelligently. It was very serious. It was not done, maybe the marketing department might have wanted to grab attention and headlines. But the editorial department that put that thing together and decided on it had pure motives in mind. And they do in all the other gambles that I've seen, even if I think the gamble is bad. Excuse me. And today's book is such a gamble. The problem with those unconventional choices is that they aren't classics. And you can't make something a classic by declaring that. One of the active elements in making something a classic is time. And that's the one thing you can't just decide on. And it's the one thing you can't know. As any of you who have studied literature will know. Because you only have to go back 50 years, 100 years, 200 years to be surrounded by books that pontificators of the day were calling classics that no one remembers anymore. That's a common phenomenon. And so time becomes an active and legitimate concern in estimating whether or not something is a classic. And then there's a question of literary value. And the book that we're looking at today is a classic of a kind. If by passage of time we mean that it has never been forgotten. But it has no literary merit whatsoever. This is a magnificent edition of a work that doesn't deserve a magnificent edition. It's a magnificent edition of a work that doesn't deserve to be part of the Penguin Classic lineup. And that is this. That is the Prophecies of Nostradamus. This is a dual language edition, so you have the French on one side and the English on the other. That's amazing right there. That takes a lot of work. Again, even though I don't agree with this, it's like the Morrissey volume. This is a labor of intellectual love. This whole volume is. So I'm looking at it, and on one level I'm objecting completely. This does not belong in a classics library of any kind. This is not a literary classic, nor is it a social classic. It's remembered for bad reasons. Negative, stupid, ignorant reasons. And that's not good enough, shouldn't be good enough to make it a Penguin Classic. On the one hand, I'm thinking that. On the other hand, I'm noticing there's a long introduction and great notes here by Stephen Gershon. They are tremendous. The introduction to this is incredibly long. The notes are incredibly thorough. That critical apparatus all by itself is amazing. The fact that they would do a dual language translation is amazing. And the translation itself is by Richard Seaberth, and it is also just fantastic. This is the best ordinary, easily available English language edition of Nostradamus that anyone could want. My objection isn't that. My objection is that no one should want this. Because it's not possible to tell the future. There is no such thing. In the introduction here, Nostradamus is referred to in his brief biography as a French doctor, astrologer, and seer. He was not a seer. There are no seers. There is no supernatural. The future hasn't happened yet, so you can't predict it. There are no seers. There is no mystical element to life. There is no supernatural element to life. And here you have in the Penguin Classic biography of the author of this book, you have him described in supernatural terms. That bothers me. And the fact that that is there is because the Penguin knows perfectly well who this book is aimed for. The people who think there's anything to Nostradamus. There isn't. There isn't. There isn't anything to him or to Edward Casey or to Gene Dixon or any of these other frauds. And unfortunately, I think that Stephen Gershon, the guy who did the notes and introduction, is a believer in this nonsense. I'm going to read you a bit from one of the explanatory notes for one of the quatrains. Let's see here. Readers thus uncovered political forces such as communism in the quatrains, but they also found leaders and celebrities galore, each one triggering a new burst of interest in Nostradamus. In 1963, a Chicago Tribune columnist suggested that quatrain 8.97 had predicted that three brothers would take over the government. Here's the quatrain in English. At the limits of the Var power shall change, near its banks three fine children shall be born. Ruin to the people when they come of age, so altering the realm it shall grow no more. Okay, Var is not the United States. The three children are not necessarily siblings, and it's promised that they will bring destruction. But what does our annotator say? It was, of course, the Kennedys. No, it wasn't, of course, the Kennedys. If Nostradamus back in 1505 had been a seer, he would have said the word Kennedys. That's how you predict the future. You don't develop a new religion and then say that the Old Testament predicts it by saying, see, the Old Testament predicted that our Savior would be born. No, the Old Testament said somebody named Emmanuel would be born. If it had been a prophecy in the Old Testament, they would have said Jesus Christ was born. And they didn't, nor say anything like it. Same thing with all the other biblical prophecies that are alleged to be true. That's a whole video for another time. But that is not obviously the case. He says, of course, the Kennedys. No. The only way it's of course the Kennedys if it says the Kennedys and names them. Maybe mentions Massachusetts. Maybe says United States instead of the limits of the Var power. But anyway, he goes on. The columnist devoted little attention to the dire third verse, but in the 1970s and 80s, interpreters claimed that quatrain 1.26 described the assassinations of John F. and Robert Kennedy. Here's the quatrain. During daytime, a great clap of lightning, ill omen for the bearer of tidings, the following portent falling at night, conflict in Rams, London, Tuscan blight. Nonsense, of course, gibberish, as Nostradamus wrote. This whole book is gibberish. But what does our annotator say? The president was shot down by a sudden thunderbolt in broad daylight. No, he wasn't. He was shot by a rifle. A weapon that didn't exist when Nostradamus wrote this, but he's a seer. He was shot by a rifle. He wasn't killed by a thunderbolt. He was killed by a rifle. He was killed by gunfire. In Dealey Plaza, in Texas. Not in London. Not in the plains of Tuscany. He was killed in Dealey Plaza in Texas. Why is that not in the quatrain? It would be gibberish. Nostradamus writes gibberish, but it would be gibberish that we could look back and say, well, it was gibberish to them, but it's true to us. But no, our interpreter goes on. The second verse referred to the many warnings and threats that both men had received during their terms. No, the second verse is ill omen from the bearer of tidings, not to the bearer of tidings, from them. The bearer of tidings is giving the ill omen. He's not receiving it. That second verse does not refer to that. That's just anyway. The last verse outlined the international repercussions of their deaths. I think that the cities of Tuscany sent a card to the White House. I'm pretty sure that they did. There was no blight in Tuscany, and there was no conflict. I'm pretty sure that London sent its condolences. No conflict, no blight. No repercussions, in other words. In this quatrain, as in so many others, the individual and the collective come together. See, if you're going to do that kind of interpretive crapola, then you can make anything into anything else. And writers have been doing that with this fraud forever, since he wrote these quatrains all those time ago. So this is, I think that our annotator is a true believer, and that's a little depressing, because this is nonsense. And since it's nonsense, I kind of don't want it to be a Penguin Classic. I'm okay with non-literary items, with items that have no literary value. I'm okay with them being Penguin Classics. We're going to see a few of them, and I've recommended more. The Fanny Farmer Cookbook, I would love to be a Penguin Classic. It has no literary value. There already is a Penguin Classic of the military dispatches of General Wellington. That certainly has no literary value. I'm okay with that. That element of this doesn't bother me so much as that this perpetuates harm. This is meant to Nostradamus has always, in his own lifetime and ever since, bilked money out of the biddable, the credulous. And this is meant to do the same thing. This is meant to pull money out of the same places. If it were an introduction and an annotation that wasn't on board, that didn't call Nostradamus a seer, that didn't say that he was obviously predicting things when he obviously isn't, if it was just a historical, critical overview of this author, then maybe, but it costs a lot of time and effort and money to make a Penguin Classic. Naturally, I see a volume like this in the mail, and I immediately come up with 20 that I could think of that don't exist that I wish had taken the time and effort and money of this book. So, your Penguin Classic today is a recommendation in terms of the scrupulousness with which this volume was done, but it's not a recommendation in any other way. This isn't worth your time. It isn't worth your money or attention. It doesn't stand anywhere near. It's on the same bookcase for me, but it doesn't stand anywhere near any of the other things that we're talking about. And as just a parenthetical, if you're ever tempted to believe this crap, or your daily horoscope in the paper, or Gene Dixon, or Edgar Casey, or anyone else, you shouldn't. I know it's tempting, but you shouldn't. You shouldn't do it. This is nonsense. And the way that you can tell, the way that it could announce that it isn't nonsense is extremely clear. There is, in fact, only one way, and that is for a Nostradamus quatrain to predict something. Not to mention that a wolf may be in the fold, and then 500 years later we say, well, obviously he's talking about Hitler. No, if he were a seer, if he could pierce the veil of time and see the future, he would have used the word Hitler. And over again with everybody else, with all of these people. If you're someone like Gene Dixon and you make 50 prophecies a day, then you're going to get something right. If you're in the 1960 and you say, well, our new president Kennedy, I prophesy that he will be assassinated. Okay, he's president. He's going to have lots of people trying to kill him, and Lyndon Johnson, who never claimed to have prophetic powers, is on record, has been attested to telling people, well, 1 in 4 presidents have died in office. I kind of like those odds. I'm a gambling man. Is he a seer? No. The only way to do it is with specifics, and prophecies never have them, of course, because they can't, because they'll be wrong more often than they're right. The way that frauds like Gene Dixon survive is because people remember the 1 or 2 right things and forget the 900 wrong things, and that applies here. This author was not a seer. He could not predict the future because that's impossible. There are no mystical powers, and he didn't have any, and there are no accurate predictions in here. Obviously, I hope that goes without saying. So you have a definitive English language edition, a dual language annotated edition of the history and the reception and whatnot of Nostradamus, but under no circumstances should you waste your time reading this. So we're going to have to hope for better from tomorrow's Penguin Classic. We shall see. Can't get any worse, so you can only go up from here. So I'll wrap this up, but I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.